The past year has been a wild ride for us all, with plenty of challenges to go around. But the one constant in the midst of these uncertain times is you. Through it all, our customers inspire us by using the power of web ops to create unbelievable digital experiences, drive organizations' missions forward, and make the world a better place. You provided a lifeline to refugees and housed homeless children around the world. You led the charge for social change and charted the way for human movements. You turned your schools and businesses on a dime and radically adapted how you delivered your services, and so much more. This year, Pantheon reached new heights too, achieving unicorn status with our Series E funding. We couldn't have done it without our incredible partners and customers. What we're saying is, you are amazing. Yes, you. We can't wait to see how you will continue to show up for your communities and the causes that matter most to you. Every step of the way, you can count on your teammates at Pantheon to be there. Thank you for everything you do.
Hello, everyone. It's good to see humans. It's been a long time. It feels a little bit like a family reunion with 1,500 of my favorite nerds. Welcome back. It's really my honor to get to introduce this panel. And we'll have Dries and the team up pretty soon. I've known Dries for a long time. I dropped out of school to work on Drupal, a Drupal project. And then 6 of us conspired to try to get Dries to drop out of his PhD program. And we failed, because he's actually smarter than myself and all of us. So he's a doctor now. And I was thinking back about the topic for this panel and realizing that I've been working in this problem space for almost 20 years, my entire career. Same thing as with my co-founders at Pantheon. I know the same thing for Dries. We were just chatting about this a minute ago. So why do you work on polish the same tile and work on the same problem for 2 decades of your career? It's been my entire career. And I think about that actually a lot. And the answer is, I think it really matters what we're doing. If I look back at the last 5 years or the past 10 years, if you look at all of the big challenges that we have, I'm talking at the level of managing pandemics, dealing with autocratic dictators invading countries, climate change. It's undeniable that the open internet is going to play, and is playing today, a crucial role in all of those human challenges. It plays a really important role. And there's a world that we could easily live in where that didn't exist. You can just close your eyes and think about a world where all of the news, all the global information via the internet was gatekept either by a government and or a company like Facebook or Apple. And I use Instagram, I use my iPhone, I think they're great products, but that's a very different world. And I don't take that for granted. I just don't believe that good things that exist stick around. I really think you have to fight for them. And I was idealistic once when I dropped out of school. And I thought more in that vein. I was maybe a bit of an open source zealot at the time. I thought good things would just happen because they're good. And, the last 20 years, we've seen a lot of unfortunate things happen to good people. And good things only happen when you fight for them. They don't happen by default. What I mean by that is being honest and wrestling with the big, hard problems. I think something my technology industry has a challenge with is whining. We like to whine a lot. Oh, woe is me. Why do I have to figure out how to manage the conversations on the platform the whole world uses as their public comments? This is so hard. Well, if you end up being the platform that is the public commons for the global conversation, yeah, it's hard. That's part of the deal. And that's why I was so excited when I was asked, and really is an honor to introduce this panel, is I think it's honoring asking those hard questions. And I think the questions are really actually not just theoretical for us in the open source Drupal community. I think we're actually at a crossroads on some of these questions. So taking it down a notch, I don't think open source is a given, personally. I think open source is, and the communities around open source products are unleash an amazing amount of creativity. They bring meaning to your work. They build community. These are hugely powerful things. But I think they only exist in a world where they create value and they make the world better in meaningful, tangible ways. Honestly, in ways that get budgeted for in organizations. And I think the crossroads that I think we're at in the Drupal ecosystem, the WordPress ecosystem, the open source ecosystem for website technology, is the world is changing. You know, the customers, the marketing organizations, the folks who, have goals around driving engagement with their customers, their users, they expect us and the products and tools and experiences that we build to enable them to build meaningful relationships and connections with their customers. And they honestly don't care about open source IP licensing regimes. Like when I talk to marketers about open source licensing regimes, their eyes roll back in the back of their heads. They care about the power of the tools to enable them to be successful. And I think that's the moment in time that we're in. I think that's something at Pantheon we think we obsess over that question. How are we going to make these tools actually impactful on the missions of the organizations? How do we unlock the power of the internet for all of the customers? But at a societal level, I really think this, what the role of the open internet is in society is a really important question to be asking, because the open internet is not all rainbows and sunshine. There are bad actors who will do vicious things on the open internet. And it's our job, I think, as a community, to truly wrestle with what we're going to do about that. And I don't think there are any easy answers, because anytime you're talking about, meddling with or changing the rules by which people can have conversations, you're literally you're thinking about a way in which you're going to interfere or change how the way people speak to their communities. And that cuts at the core of democratic society. That's something we've been wrestling with for probably since the Roman times. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to Tim, who will answer all of these questions with our panelists. Thank you all.
Well, Zach, thank you for the phenomenal introduction to the topic today and to the conversation we're going to have. I will caution that we will not answer all of these questions, but we'll give a really enthusiastic attempt to consider these problems in a meaningful and nuanced way, and hopefully inspire everyone out there to find ways that they can contribute to the answers to these questions. Briefly, before we begin, I do want to go through some housekeeping, some things to get us ready for DrupalCon. So first of all, it is wonderful to be here with you, to be back in person together, to be here in Portland. And it's only because we have your cooperation that we can make this possible. Firstly, I think for everyone here, we've spent 2 years or more not interacting in these big social situations, and everyone's a little bit nervous, a little bit unsure. Your speakers are doing it for the first time in a while, and your empathy and compassion is really going to help make this an enjoyable and comfortable experience for everyone. Furthermore, we ask that you continue to follow our COVID safety policies throughout the event, the testing available outside of the convention center, masking in these spaces, and all of these things, to try and keep our community as safe as we can as we come out of the tail end of the pandemic. Finally, we ask you to keep in mind the DrupalCon Code of Conduct and the Drupal Code of Conduct. If you haven't seen it already, you can get the information in your program handbook or on the website. You can use the QR code. If you are in a situation where you feel you need help, please feel free to go to the registration desk or find a Drupal Association staff member. We will help you right away. And if you just need to report on something perhaps that makes you uncomfortable, you can always use the conduct@association.drupal.org email address. So I want to talk a little bit about the other keynotes that are coming this week. So first, we are going to have tomorrow a keynote on how to combat global systems of oppression in the tech industry by Mala Kumar, Dalen Moyer, and Marcus Carter II. I think it'll be a fantastic conversation, and welcome you to join us then. On Wednesday, we will have the traditional Dries note with an introduction by the Drupal Association leadership team. We'll talk a little bit about the program's of the Drupal Association and how they support the community and how your support enables our work. And then on Thursday, we'll have a fireside chat about open sourcing diversity, equity, and inclusion with Dimitris Cheetham and Lauren Maffeo. So you are also invited. This evening, there will be a welcome reception in the exhibit hall at the end of the day, around 5:20 p.m. We hope you'll join us there, meet with your colleagues and old friends who you haven't seen for a while, and get ready for the rest of the event. We also invite you every day to participate in contribution. Contribution is fully half of the experience of DrupalCon. So there's general contribution open in the ballrooms right next door, so you can come and participate in making Drupal better. There's also mentored contribution and migration assistance available on Wednesday and Thursday, both days. We hope you'll join us there. Finally, right after this keynote, we will be gathering in the atrium outside of the exhibit hall for a group photo, the traditional DrupalCon group photo, which I think will be a poignant event with all of us back together again. So without further ado, we're going to get started here. So let's get on with the show. I would like to welcome up to the stage with me, Dries Buytaert, the founder of Drupal, founder and CTO of Acquia, Adam Silverstein, a developer relations engineer at Google and core committer for WordPress, and Meg Stritti, vice president of quality for GitLab. All right, so as Zach mentioned in his wonderful introduction to this conversation, there are a lot of challenges in technology, on the internet, and in open source that have human faces and human consequences. And we're going to start off by talking about some of the challenges that came to the fore over the course of the pandemic and sort of the transformation from an in-person reality to a very digital reality. So I think we'll kick it off here. So as the world begins to open up after these sort of 2 years of lockdown, I want to reflect about how our lives became more digital and what were the positives and negatives of that situation. So Meg, maybe you could kick us off. What was the most sort of connected experience? How did you experience this change to a digital community at its best?
Sure. I think things have been more connected. Some of the good things I've seen are self-organized tech communities during the COVID outbreak. People creating apps that list where the patients are, routing to the hospitals. I've seen apps that connect the grocery stores because hotels run out of business. They connect the groceries to the buyers directly. Those are really great things to see. Yeah.
Awesome. And how about you, Adam?
I have to say that mostly I've had a pretty bad experience with it. I've tried to go to conferences online. I've spoken at a couple conferences online. It's very challenging to talk at a screen. It's nice to see people in the audience, even if I can't really see you. One really good experience I had was the Chrome Dev Conference. They did like an online thing where it was like a kind of like a pixel video game where you could go in, you had like a little avatar, and other people who were at the conference were also in this game. And so there was a little more interactivity, and there were kind of events and things you could do in there. So I liked, there were a lot of things that came out of it where there were different technologies for meeting online that were kind of new. People experimented with a lot of really cool stuff. Some more successful than others, but I liked that we tried to do it anyway.
Fair enough. How about you, Dries?
Yeah. I know the negative was like all these back-to-back Zoom meetings, to be honest, all day long. But one of the positives actually has been DrupalCon, the digital or virtual DrupalCons. And what else did you expect me to say? I mean, that was actually a great experience. And maybe one of the highlights was that by going virtual with DrupalCon, it was actually a little bit more inclusive, and it was really nice at these virtual DrupalCons to talk to people that would otherwise not have been able to attend a DrupalCon because maybe financially the travel is too far, these kinds of things. And so I've had some beautiful, really nice, memorable interactions with people in the Drupal community that maybe otherwise would have been hard to have, or harder to have. So, but that's a positive,
Absolutely. Fantastic. Well, let's address this problem this problem space of the internet having become the new public square. a place of free exchange of ideas and information that has unbelievable access and reach. A new idea can span the globe in the course of, how long does it take to click the retweet button? Like, instantly. And that access to information is obviously a tremendous boon, but it comes along with some negatives. Most of these platforms are privatized platforms for speech. They're mediated by business interests, by proprietary algorithms and things like that. And that reach applies equally to facts and to misinformation. So as some of you may have seen, President Obama just gave a presentation at Stanford about misinformation and disinformation. And as he put it, there are people who are dying because of misinformation. And he put forward that he believes that everyone has a part to play, technological innovators like ourselves, governments through regulation, and just individual actors and users. So I'd like to talk about that a little bit. What do we as open source advocates do to foster the value of the internet as a public square and maybe manage some of these risks or downsides? Meg, would you like to start?
Sure. I think one of the concepts that you've seen more and more is this concept of a global citizen, how you empower people to speak up when they see something is wrong. And that's the core part of having a community and having people be able to speak up if they see something that's amiss. I think having transparency is important. You don't know how posts are ranked. Suddenly they appear onto your screen. I think having transparency around this area is going to be better for the overall.
Yeah. I would say as someone who helps build open source platforms, like I'm a WordPress core committer, you have to accept that what you're building can be used by people who you don't agree with. You're building something that's a tool that anyone can use. So you can't really take responsibility as a platform for the information, at least for a distributed open source platform. I think a little bit differently about it, right? Because when you go to Google and you search for information, there is a responsibility there to provide balanced information, and that is a huge challenge. Back in the day, Google would just show the top result, whatever the algorithm said, and that was how we found information. But now you find more facts when you search Google. You'll search for something like, is the Earth round? And it'll say, yes, the Earth is round. But if you search for something more controversial that has maybe multiple sides of the story, you get a more nuanced result. So if you search for something like, is milk healthy? Right? So some people will say yes, some people will say no. And what you'll see in the search results is you'll see like the first result, and then you'll see something that says, other authoritative sources say this. So I think like that's a good example of a technological solution to providing a more balanced information. So I'm hopeful in some ways that we can move in that direction, but I think it's a huge challenge.
I mean, I can add something. I think transparency is key, and there's a lot of algorithms, not just web algorithms, that are having a huge impact on society. I mean, we send people to jail based on DNA tests. But the algorithm that does the test is proprietary. To me, that's really scary. Like, I would rather have that algorithm be open source so people can actually look at it and see how does it make decisions, especially when people's lives are impacted by that. So I do think that open source could be part of the solution here, where I would love to see more of these impactful algorithms that really change the outcome for society. They should be transparent, and open source is a way to make them transparent. So also I'm a little scared about these big centralized, organizations like Twitter, Facebook. I very much believe that the future should be more decentralized. I'd love for Twitter and Facebook to be protocols where many organizations can be part of a larger kind of, collection of organizations, and again with transparency, APIs, and the ability for multiple different entities to actually take a look at how all these things work and maybe provide alternative algorithms for ranking, all these kinds of things. So I think what we're doing with open source is actually kind of going in the right direction. And I think there's even technologies in our space, like the indie web-related technologies, which I think are pretty intriguing and maybe don't have enough visibility and awareness. but they provide alternatives for how information can be shared and spread without having to rely on these huge centralized companies that operate as black boxes.
I think that's fair. I think let's dig into two elements of what I heard. So the first having to do with these proprietary algorithms and how they're managed and how we think about them. And then after that, I want to talk about this concept of centralized authority and decentralized authority and perhaps technological solutions to that. So on the proprietary algorithm side, we have obviously your social media feeds. We have search engine algorithms, Google famously. We have the concepts of public access in kind of the civic space in many different places, but rarely is it applied to civic use of technology, voting machines, auditable source code for those sorts of things, as you said, for the DNA tests that we convict based on, things like that. So I'd like each of you to respond to, for those elements of civic engagement or these large centralized systems, what's the role we can play as either as individuals or organizations or advocates to attempt to achieve that transparency or to attempt that change? And then we'll look at what we can do on a decentralized scale after that. So do we advocate for regulation? Do we try and bootstrap alternatives? Where do we go from here? So Adam, I'm going to pick on you first, actually.
Sure. In terms of like open sourcing algorithms, I'm not actually sure what that means. Like I don't know. Like Google has like a whole team of engineers that are like devoted to developing their search algorithm, and it's probably not something any single person could understand. But I love the idea of attribution, of having something in the results where you can, maybe it's just a little icon that you can click on that explains why you're seeing those results, that more explains the algorithm. Or why it surfaced what it surfaced to you. That seems something that could be doable. I don't really know about, like, I understand like the idea of open sourcing, but I don't know how it helps anyone.
Well, and that's one of the interesting things. If we look at regulation, if we look at things like GDPR, for example, one of the key elements of the provisions of the GDPR is human readable versions of the information about how your privacy data is used and things like that, right? Because we are not trying to create transparency for technologists who understand algorithmic sorting functions and all these sorts of things. We're hopefully trying to create transparency for whole communities.
Yeah.
So I think that's a nuance that's important in these solutions for sure. Mech, would you like to respond or add any ideas?
Sure. My thoughts are around making it source available, which is something we do at GitLab. We show the source code and how it's being built. That's transparency. And another component is a feedback loop. You establish a way for people to voice their concerns or voice their opinions and have iterations to improve that. Applying that pattern to other cases, like you said, the civic use case can be challenging because they have multiple processes around the civic framework. I think if there's enough voice around it, enough people talking about it, I believe we can make progress here.
Dries, what would you add?
Yeah, but I agree with all of these thoughts. First of all, I have two comments maybe. I think, yes, some of these algorithms are really, really complex and it will be very hard to audit them, but I do think if you're impacted by them, you'll find people that will audit them, I think, if you're sent to jail and you feel it's not right, you may want to look at, how the DNA test worked, and you may have enough persistence to work through all of these things. My second point, and it's not always popular in the US, is I do believe legislation has a big role to play. I do think our governments are falling us short, And the parallel that I've made in the past is like, go back 100 years, people were making drugs in their garages and selling it to people, and it led to the, FDA, I think, the Food and Drug Administration, being born to audit and standardize qualities around food and drugs so that not everybody can just go around and, sell some drugs. And I'm sure that was very big change for the world. I'm sure that cost billions and billions of dollars to put in place. I'm sure that's really hard to go and, kind of like instrument the drug making process and make sure everything works as it should, let's say. But I do think there's something like that missing for software algorithms. I do believe there should probably be an organization that looks at these big algorithms that impact billions of people. I don't think they should look at every algorithm, but there are algorithms that impact billions of people. So I think it's worth spending money and resources making sure that these, are unbiased and work as intended and don't have negative impact on society. And I feel like that hasn't been created yet, right? Because if you leave it up to the organizations, bad things are going to happen. And I'm not the first person to say this, but like a common example that is given is self-driving cars. It has software in it. At some point, these algorithms have to make tough decisions. Like, let's say some pedestrians jump in front of the car. What do you do? Do you hit the pedestrians and save the passenger? Or do you, change the direction of the car, potentially killing the driver? Guess what every car company is going to do? They're going to try and save the driver because that's the way to sell their cars. Like, imagine you're the one car company that's going to save the pedestrians. Probably not a good commercial decision, so to speak, right? So I think there is a role for governments to help us figure that out and guide us through, like, what do you do with these difficult situations and algorithms?
And I hate to say it, but there's a reality that in some ways the introduction of the government regulation can provide relief at the organizational scale to say, we no longer have to worry about a competitor saying that we're a danger to our driver, because now we know we're on a level playing field and they have enabled us to do the right thing in a better way. And there's clearly potential there. Let's turn to the subject of decentralized solutions, because it's very challenging sometimes to think about how do we impact governmental regulation, how do we impact the algorithm of large corporations, but perhaps there's ways to bypass those levels of control or to introduce new solutions. Now, this is going to be controversial as well, because I think one of the most challenging and disruptive ideas on the web in the last several years in particular has been everything around blockchain, right? It's kind of the inevitable conversation when we talk about decentralization. The promise was trust without a central authority or a distributed digital ledger. And that's a powerful idea, but it's been drowned out by crass profiteering, disregard for environmental impact, and a lot of other things. So is it possible to rehabilitate the technological promise of an idea like blockchain-based decentralization to solve some of these problems? Is there somewhere else we need to look? What can we do other than relying on central authorities to shape up? Dries, I'll start at your end this time.
Yeah, well, it's a very polarizing topic, the blockchain. Let's see, I think I haven't really invested much time or resources in to the blockchain because I'm very conscious of the negative impact on climate, for example. But I have dabbled because I do think it's useful to, keep an eye on what's happening. And I do think the blockchain has a lot of potential. And I do know that many organizations are working on minimizing or reducing the impact on climate. So I think that's encouraging. But I do think that the blockchain could offer solutions to important problems. Like one of the big problems I see is that value doesn't always flow back to, to the artists or the creators. And we see that in music, we see that in art, we see that in open source, frankly. A lot of people write open source software, and the value doesn't always flow back to the contributor, the individual contributor. And so blockchain-based solutions may be able to solve some of these things, right? People are doing a lot of experiments around these things, or blockchain-based solutions, they may lead to new governance models on how you work together as a global community. So there's interesting things, and I do think that eventually there will be blockchain-based building blocks, if you will, that will be part of our tool chain. Or, if you want to build certain kinds of digital applications or digital experiences, you may leverage a blockchain component for something. And so I think we have to kind of, wait and see. That's my kind of approach. Like, I don't like it right now because it's so bad. But it's also interesting to see, and eventually maybe it will be less impactful for climate. So,
Adam, any thoughts?
I have to agree with a lot of that. I have the same sort of environmental concerns. I wanted to say one thing just about centralized systems more generally in the open web, and something that I've seen is the success of these closed systems and thinking about how successful they are. When I'm talking about closed systems, I'm talking about sort of the Facebook and TikTok and Instagrams of the world, where you go to create content and it might be available on the web, but it's essentially in this system that people will discover it there. And those platforms have been incredibly successful, and so much content is being created on them. And I think there's a reason for that, right? There's a reason that people choose to go there rather than create a website and try to launch whatever they're creating on the web. And that's something that, as an open source community and as builders of platforms, we need to think about. And I'm glad you mentioned the indie web, because I think like the concepts of the indie web and the idea of being able to share from one website to another or comment on someone's website without having to log into that website is a challenge we need to solve on the open web. And part of the reason these platforms are so successful is they've reduced all the friction. It's really easy to get started. It's really easy to get followers. It's really easy to monetize. We don't really do that very well on the web in general. It's pretty hard. So to the point of blockchain, I don't really have a lot of thoughts specifically about that. But I did notice when I was like learning about blockchain that it has striking similarity to Git. In that it has a chain, just the way that like Git commits have a chain always to the parent and to the child, and it's sort of immutable in the same way, although obviously you can override that in Git a little bit. But I definitely feel like there will be technologies, and maybe I just don't know about them, that emerge with the blockchain that will be really valuable. Given all the noise right now about NFTs and cryptocurrencies, I'm less interested. But I'm more interested in the technologies that come in the future that are built on blockchain but aren't necessarily in those fields at all.
Fair enough. How about you, Mac? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I also not as involved as my peers. I agree with many of those points. It's unfortunate that some of the well-known cryptocurrencies consume a lot of energy when it's created, and I think it's because it's used as a store of value. I'm encouraged by other alternatives, blockchain technologies that are more sustainable to the environment, but it's just not that well known yet. I think it's on us to help adoption in these areas, to point to the ones that are more responsible. And I think the glue between these cryptocurrencies and blockchain is also important. If the ecosystem is healthy and they have integrations to multiple use cases, then those more sustainable ones may get more use, may get more popular. And I also think that blockchain has its uses when you want to store a single source of truth that is non-arguable. I think that there are many uses for that. Ecosystem is important because when more of these gets created, which is the single source of truth blockchain? If there are duplicates, right, you need to do cross-validation, cross-checking on our network. So I think having a healthy ecosystem is a crucial point in this.
Maybe to add something, what Adam said, it's like, the Twitters and the Facebooks are so successful, right? And why haven't we been able to create an open, distributed alternative to them? But that, I think, is an intriguing question because, and I think the reality, and it's linked with the blockchain too, because I think when people try to create these open, decentralized systems or protocols like the blockchain, it takes a lot of time and it's slow. Like, think about the blockchain, like they probably got like $1 trillion in funding across all of the different initiatives and, whatever. And what is there to show for? Not much, like give $1 trillion to a company and they have a lot more to show for, I think, right? And so, and the same is a little bit true, like to like the indie web and stuff. Like, I feel like maybe one takeaway, I don't know, is like it requires a longer horizon, investment horizon, a lot more patience to build solid alternatives, And maybe that's something that we can think about as open source contributors. It's like, we're not going to create something better than Facebook or Twitter overnight, And if we truly want to make something decentralized, that is as easy to use and as desired, I guess, by end users, it's going to take a long time, and we have to have people and teams that are investing in that for probably decades, because we can't move as fast, because the way we have to solve things is a lot more complex, because we want to maybe be more decentralized. So, I think being able to take that long-term view, I think, is very valuable. And it feels a little bit like that's what's happening in the blockchain, too. Like, they don't have a lot to show for, in my mind. But maybe they're building on longer-term, valuable things that we just haven't grasped yet. So,
I'd like to actually dig a little further into this concept of, Adam, as you said, the friction being a huge part of the success of the alternative platforms, and therefore a big barrier for the open web and open source projects. Like, what are our avenues to explore to try and solve for that? Because it's almost always going to be true that a new VC-funded operation is going to be able to put some of the greatest UX designers on solving a problem and turn something around in 3 months, crunch time, all the way through. So what do we do to get out in front of this, or to show the value of these longer-term solutions before we get there, right? Any thoughts?
I have one thought, which is something I just installed Drupal on my local machine for the first time in a decade, because I come from the WordPress world, so hit me with your hate or whatever. But one thing I really liked was the demo kind of theme that you can install during the installation process, and the way that includes also all the bundles. And I think there's a word for it. You said it's like a package, basically.
Distribution.
Distribution,
it's
right?
Umami. I think you're referring to Umami,
exactly.
the theme.
So I love this concept of a package
distribution.
Distribution. Thank you. I'll get it by the end of the of a distribution.
We'll convert him by the end of the week.
A distribution that you can, you want to launch like a barber shop or whatever, and you need these specific features for your site. Like, mostly in the WordPress world, you're just kind of dropped into this blank slate, and it's up to you to figure out which of the 50,000 plugins that are out there might work for you. I love the idea that you could provide a platform that actually provided all the things you needed out of the box. And you could have different sort of verticals that you targeted with that. That's one way, I think, to lower the friction. I think it's a huge challenge. I mean, I think part of it is just the sophistication of the web and all the things you need to do to be successful on the web. It's a challenge for sort of a general, and it's when I think of it, I think of small business owners, right? I mean, I've worked on enterprise sites, but I think a lot about small business owners and people who are just trying to have a website because they know they need to have a website, and suddenly they have to wear this extra hat. Like I'm a website owner now. That's a real challenge. They just want to be a barber or whatever. So we need to make it easier, I think, for people to both get started on the web and then also to sort of be successful with their website, whatever that means for them.
Yeah, I agree. And it's actually in the Drupal world, that's been a bit of a transformation too, because, and largely my fault, I think, our original culture was, built by developers for developers. Like when I started Drupal, I just built it for myself, and I didn't care at all about making it easy to use for others, right? And I'm very proud that in the Drupal project, we've slowly started to change that mindset, and we're not just building things for ourselves, but we're also building things for our end users, which often are, a lot less technical than developers. So, and that takes an extra effort to think about others and to build something for others as well. It's the less fast approach to open source, but it's the more long-term valuable way of building open source.
Awesome. So I want to step back for a second, revisit one of the other topics we started about. We spoke about regulation, and I mentioned, for example, the GDPR in Europe and its impact. And when we talk about the role that government could play, that regulation could play in the web, we see increasing attention to, increasing fluency with regulation. But here in the United States, for example, it's very state by state. And across the world, it's very country by country. And the web, famously, is the World Wide Web. And some people have said that alongside the privacy protections we're seeing, we're also perhaps bringing borders to the web. This is the phrase I've seen before, to something that perhaps at least had the sense that it was a borderless community. Do you see it that way? Do you see a regulatory risk in the way we treat borders when we're trying to solve these problems? Or do you see other consequences of this regulation? I'm gonna throw it. Mech, how about you?
Sure. I think there's a component of where you are and the local laws. You need to abide by that. And then just finding a balance between that and having an open border. I agree it's still going to be a challenge because you need to find that balance. I think GDPR is an example of the local regulations that is applicable to that region and how it affects the other parts of the region. So I think it's up to us to find the balance. I don't think we'll find the answer today. It's still going to be something we still need to navigate. Adam?
So I sort of the opposite reaction. I think it sort of breaks down the borders in the sense that, like my experience with GDPR is that, at least for enterprise customers, they're going to put the GDPR compliant thing on their website everywhere. They're not going to just show that in Europe. Like, that's too much effort. So they're going to take this rule that's like in one country and they're going to apply it worldwide because their website is available worldwide. So in a way, it actually makes what one country does affect the whole world. It sort of breaks down some borders in a sense. But it definitely sort of changes how you think about developing for the web if you have to consider that you have to abide by the rules everywhere. It reminds me a little bit of when we used to try to have to figure out sales tax if you had an e-commerce store in the US. And it was incredibly complicated because every state had different tax laws. And it was like up to you to, supposedly your responsibility to figure all that all out. What happened in the meantime is all these services came about that do it for you, right? So I think we might see things like that in the future, like GDPR as a service, where you just add a little script to your site and that company takes care of the complexity of where the laws are that the person's viewing the site is. But I kind of had the opposite reaction. I think it breaks borders down.
Yeah, I really like what you said, Adam. Like for me, I've been thinking about this question a little bit. Like as an end user, I don't experience borders. I really don't. But I can imagine as a business, it's more complex, right? You have to implement all of these different regulations depending on where your visitors and customers are. So the tax calculation example is a great example. And so yeah, for businesses it becomes hard. But to your point, that's an opportunity for others to step in with products and services to make that easy. So I don't know. I think for me, net GDPR has been a great thing. I feel like it's a positive for the web. I do hate all of the little pop-ups, though. I mean, I do think there's a better solution for that, technical solution. There has to be a better technical solution. But overall, all in all, I think GDPR has been good.
Okay, very good. So in that case, I want to start talking a little bit about security considerations as well, right? So we've touched on regulation, centralization, decentralization, risks and threats to the open web on that front. There are also things that just come alongside with the pace of innovation. So when it comes to modern software development, we've moved to these distributed dependency models, right? We're doing dependency resolution of packages. We're using Composer in the Drupal world. You're using NPM. You're using all sorts of these things. We don't build software from monolithic code bases anymore, right? And it's relatively rare that you would fully understand all of the different kind of dependencies in your tree. So what impact does that have on sort of security landscape and the sort of safety posture of what we do on the web? And how should we be thinking about that?
Sure. I think there's no one process that's going to safeguard everything. I think you need to layer multiple guardrails because one person can make a mistake, and multiple redundancies of guardrails will help. I think it's also important to highlight ethical hackers and the bug bounty programs out there. That's, again, a community that helps you monitor these dependency injections or any bad code that gets in. I think working with the community and DevSecOps is also here to stay. It used to be DevOps, now it's DevSecOps. So security is in the first forefront when you build software. And then the multiple layers of guardrails.
Yeah, it worries me, I'll say. I think, like, especially in the JavaScript world, being the low friction of bringing in NPM packages. I read recently about a supply attack where the person actually used internal package names of large corporations that NPM would resolve off of NPM instead of the internal repositories, and they were able to just create mirror repositories and phone home from developers' computers when they installed these packages. Another problem is updates, over-the-air updates. So WordPress has auto updates. I'm sure Drupal has updates. Currently, our updates are not signed, which means that if a bad actor were able to take over the domain, for example, they could serve up millions of users with bad, hacked WordPress software. So that's a huge thing, is actually securing the supply chain with code signing and signatures, so that when you do auto updates or when you are loading packages, that you can verify that you actually got the package that you thought you were installing. So that's one thing I know technologically that we can do. It's a big problem.
Our packages will be signed.
Right? You'll be ahead of us.
Yeah. We've been working on that for quite a while, actually. More about that in separate sessions. But
yeah.
But like you, Adam, it does feel like NPM is sort of the Wild West, you know? Like you go install all these modules, you can install it in 2 seconds. When you look at the NPM package, there's no information really. It's so light on quality metrics, on all these kinds of things. When you install these NPM packages, like they have full access to your file system. People don't look at what the code does. It's scary. Yet, NPM is like growing like crazy. So that's like the weird thing about it. And in fact, I think the world and NPM, they could learn something from what we've been doing at Drupal and maybe WordPress too. But like you go to our project pages, you can see all this information. Is it covered by the security team? How many people are using it? I guess that's maybe the one thing you can see with NPM too. I'm not an expert on NPM, but you can see open bug counts, you can see activity in the project, so you can actually start to assess, like, all right, is this a Drupal module that is safe to install? And I feel like the rest of the world, NPM and others, they could probably take a lesson or two from how we're doing things in Drupal. So I think we should be proud. I think in many ways we're doing kind of NPM better on Drupal.org. I really do believe that.
So I have an interesting related question, and I'll acknowledge that none of us on stage, to my understanding, are lawyers. But how are open source licenses affected by this concept of dependency management and assembly, composable code bases on sort of an end user machine, right? So a key clause of the GPL, for example, has always been that your license compatibility is based on distributing the software together. You could use it together with other licensed things, but you couldn't distribute it with proprietary code with incompatible licenses. Now you can sort of build a software package that it's the end user technically who's pulling in dependencies of all sorts of licenses. And do you feel like our understanding of how GPL or other open source licensing should change in light of the way dependency management works? I think, as far as I know, this is sort of an unexplored consequence of this new technology for the way licensing works. But Adam, let me throw it to you first. I don't.
Sure, and the other thing that I think about that's sort of related is the GitHub Copilot, the thing that writes code for you, and it pulls the code from anywhere in any repository with no regard to license. And it's not actually like copying the code, but it's a machine learning thing that's learned how to code. So I think that's a really gray area too, where you're actually using code that someone else wrote that might not be licensed in a way that you could use it, but you still get to use it somehow through this tool. So that's a huge challenge. And in general, just when you're working in with a GPL project, you definitely have to pay attention to licenses, and you can't just willy-nilly start including things, especially if you're working on the core project. Like if you're working on something that's auxiliary, like you're saying you're going to use the software with it, then that's different. But as someone who works on core, in WordPress anyway, we have to very much pay attention to what the licenses of any software that we use. So wherever it comes from, you have to pay attention.
Yeah, same for Drupal, and it's limiting in a way because we can't obviously mix and match at will, different projects. So yeah, licensing is increasingly hard, and I don't actually know. It's a great question. Like I don't know what it means in a composer-based world, for example. But definitely at the core development level, we have to be very careful about which libraries and components we use and ship together with Drupal core. So yeah.
So Mech, at GitLab, you're obviously providing tooling, open source tooling for open source projects, right? So, among this, there's the way people license their projects and use them across GitLab. I mean, how do you internally think about helping software developers manage the licensing side of these things and the sort of shareability?
So I can start with, well, we have the free and open source version, and then we have the proprietary code.
Of GitLab itself,
GitLab
right.
itself, that it's paid to use on the production. So those are the two facets. Of course, if you are on our platform, you need to abide by the licensing and the rules that we have. I think the community and the guidelines that we set are key to this. That's what I can think of at this moment.
Sure, no worries. I think it's a really interesting area because I think organizations like perhaps the Free Software Foundation or the Software Freedom Conservancy and others are probably going to have to start grappling with this when the concept of composable code bases and where that falls within the distribution clause of open source licenses and how all that works. I will say there are technological tools to help you understand it. For those of us in the audience, obviously in the composer space, right, there's a composer licenses command that gives you the calculated licenses of all your dependencies. That's something that helps. And I think we want to try and expose some of that information on Drupal.org as well. But I think it'll be a place to play.
It also shows how hard licensing is. I mean, if you think about the GPL, it was invented when, like 25, 30 years ago? Well, the world looked a lot different when the GPL was invented. Like SAS didn't really exist. Composable architectures weren't really as much of a thing. And so, I mean, overall, I think the GPL has been very robust. But there are definitely some, like, these new things, like you mentioned, that are, weren't accounted for necessarily when it was created. So evolving licenses is a hard topic. It's tricky.
Okay, so from there, I'd like to transition a little bit to where we can apply open source principles outside of the technology sphere or not solely in the technology sphere. So some organizations have adopted what we would call sort of open source business practices or open source inspired business practices. And Mech, I'm going to go to you again because GitLab is sort of famously open. Like just as an example for those who might not know, I've interacted with the team over there before, and they'll draft marketing posts for the organization in a public repository, right, where you can see them while they're still in the draft state being working on the teams. And the CEO, Sid, famously has this sort of shadow program where he will participate across the organization and have kind of shadow colleagues in sometimes sort of scary feeling HR level, C-level type meetings. So that's kind of the radical side of these sort of open business practices. So what would you say GitLab and your organization has learned from making open source not just about software, and what would you recommend that others could learn?
Sure. Well, we do business in the open, opened roadmap. Everything is in the handbook. Everything, how we run the company is in the handbook, and it's open for contributions as well. I just merged someone correcting one of my handbook pages because there was a typo, and it should be written better this way. So business in the open. Again, we have both the open side of things, the open source side of things is a free version, and then the proprietary side, which is the pay-to-use version. But still, we see ourselves as part of the community. So GitLab employees are part of the community, customers are part of the community members are part of the community. Our bug bounty program is also part of the community, and we co-create together. And that we have contributions from both the open source side. Our customers are empowered to co-create, co-create and co-build with GitLab, and it just adds to the whole ecosystem. The whole community works together. And having everything out in the open, it's challenging, but it has a lot of benefits. Everybody knows where to look for. It's not a surprise to your customers. And I was also part of the shadow program before, a year and a half ago. It's amazing how an employee can go and see how the business is run, being next to Sid, the CEO. And I think we are a few companies, I think the first company that does this with a CEO shadow program. And I want to say again that the community is so close to our hearts, which is why we set up a new contributor success team focused on increasing communities and contributors going forward. And then we have a new leader, Nick. He's going to lead this team, and we're very excited to have him.
Nick Wiedhoff, a member of the Drupal Association Board, in fact, which is going to be very cool. Adam, how about you? I mean, obviously Google works on a lot of open source projects, and you have some familiarity from the organizations that are involved in WordPress. How can open source be applied to business practices?
Yeah, so I don't have the experience like of GitLab of really working at a truly open company like that. But I will say, I've seen in terms of just how we organize the work in WordPress, that's all done in a very open way. Everything is public. All the conversations happen in Slack or on a public website, and there's like a strong prohibition from doing things like in a channel that can't be attended publicly. You very rarely will see a team say meet over video chat, even though maybe there'd be more bandwidth and they could get more done that way because it's a closed thing, and if you didn't attend that, it's hard to catch up on it later. So I think basically my experience of it so far is primarily just this idea of doing all the work in the open so that anyone can see what anyone's doing on the team.
Fair enough. Dries, any thoughts?
I'm a big fan of trying to be more open, obviously. At Acquia, we try to be open. We're not even close to being as open as GitLab, just for the record, but I do definitely subscribe to the idea if you share sort of the business challenges with the employees, let's say, or now you can enroll everyone in helping to solve for them. Like if you don't share things openly, you're also not inviting others to help you fix things, right? So, I think being open goes a long way.
I think the subject of open source principles applied to business practices can also have an impact on something we talked about at the very beginning, inclusivity through technology, right? The virtual DrupalCons allowed a scale of inclusivity that weren't possible before. And we were talking before the panel about a really common subject, pay equity, and how open principles can support pay equity. So Mek, you talked a little bit about how you walk the line in your organization, or how your organization walks the line of creating sort of a kind of pay transparency. Can you talk a little bit about the notion of the calculator, I think you put it?
You talking about the pay calculator?
Yeah.
Okay. So before we had the salary calculator out in the open. That was our attempt at being very transparent from the beginning. Right now, it's still in the open, but it's internal only. But it's still very transparent to employees in the company to know what their pay ranges are, depending on the locale and then the roles. That's the commitment to our transparency.
Okay, are there similar sorts of practices like that? So related to pay transparency or related to other elements that could help foster better equity in work environments, whether it's like the gender pay gap or other areas? Have you experienced things that people could learn from who are running their own organizations here? Adam or Dries, thoughts?
I would say definitely if there was more transparency, that would lead to more equity. I mean, that to me seems obvious that when people find out that they're not being paid as well as someone else who has the same role or has the same tenure, then that's when they react. If it can be kept secret from everyone, then somehow it's less controversial. And I think in general, the tech world has done a very good job building up this culture of secrecy around salaries. I don't know why, but it seems like it's just common that no one will reveal their salaries and it's not to be discussed. I will say at Google, there's a very large internal employee-driven effort to share salaries just with each other. So there's like a giant spreadsheet. You can go and put your salary, and you can go look at other people's salaries. And some people are very open about it. But I think primarily it serves the interests of those who are paying the salaries to keep it secret. So I love the openness. I think we should have more of that.
Yeah, I mean, at Acquia, we don't have a calculator per se, but we do have programs in place to make sure that there's equity in pay. Like it's a hard rule. It's driven by the HR teams. We constantly benchmark people. We make sure there's no gaps in pay between different genders, for example. So it's a complete program that the HR team runs to make sure that these things don't exist.
Okay, I think with that we are running to the close of our time, but I'd like one last comment from each of you, sort of ranging back over our whole discussion. Is there something concrete that the people listening today and listening to the recording can do or should read about or should engage with in a greater way that you feel would be important moving forward? Not to just put you on the spot, but if you were to pick one thing.
Wow.
I can start.
Mick, go ahead.
I really love the concept of the greater good for all, global citizenship, and then it comes with community. I think starting with the younger generations, teaching them about the community, how you can contribute to the communities that matters to you, is key, because we need to grow the next generation that wants to contribute back to the community.
I would say cherish where you are. Cherish this community that you have here, this Drupal community. Drupal is obviously doing amazing things, and the software that Drupal has is enabling so many other people to do amazing things. So I would just say, just be happy where you are and keep investing in what you love.
Oh, I don't know, but maybe maybe a more practical thing, I guess, is check out the indie web stuff. Like it's very adjacent to what we all do. So it's a small step, I think, but there's some pretty cool things happening in there that are worth checking out. So, yeah.
Wonderful. Well, please join me in thanking each of our panelists for their time today. Thank you, everyone.